We have Congresswoman Katie Porter. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, surprised we didn't get you in the car today. I was really expecting the car.
Well, there was a little bit getting in and out of the car and walking back and forth for the votes, but actually things today in the House of Representatives ran pretty smoothly and pretty on time, which does not always happen.
So let's jump right in. I want to talk about the Justice and Policing Act versus the Justice Act in the Senate. The House bill puts an end to qualified immunity, to no-knock warrants, bans chokeholds. The Senate bill doesn't. And yet the GOP is, parading this thing around like they just penned the Declaration of Independence. And yet they have the audacity to clutch their pearls when Democrats don't jump on board. So who is the performative bullshit for?
You'd have to ask the Republicans who they're performing for, but I will tell you that I think that justice is something that we should be able to agree on as a bipartisan value of this country. And I think one of the things you see in the Senate's Justice Act is something that I've seen many times in the consumer protection space, which is an effort to substitute study and research and pilot programs instead of actual meaningful substantive change. So I don't think we need research to understand that we don't want people to die in police custody because of brutality. That we don't really need to study that. And so we know what the problem is here. Now, is it possible that some of the solutions that we've put in the Justice and Policing Act will work better than others and we'll need to revisit this topic? Of course, because this problem has been a long time in the making. It is going to take multiple efforts, I think, to get to where we want to be as a country with regard to racial justice within the policing system, much less larger issues of structural racism. But I think this effort to study the problem and have a little pilot program and collect some data really suggests that we don't know whether killing Black people is wrong, and it is. And we shouldn't need to study that problem. We should all be able to agree on what the problem is and then move on to debating different kinds of solutions. And I think what's wrong with the Justice Act is it doesn't actually contain any solutions. It just purports to say, we'll take a look at this. So I think that I've seen this so many times in the consumer protection space. Let's require some disclosure. Let's have GAO do a study. I mean, in the concept of credit cards, for example, consumers are getting price gouged. We don't need to study that problem. It's just a mathematical fact. And Breonna Taylor is dead. George Floyd is dead. And there are so many others, Ahmaud Arbery. Like we do not need to study this. We do need to be prepared to assess whether the changes we're making in the House version of the bill are producing the changes on the ground that we want. But the Senate bill doesn't do anything at all.
Right. And I mean, I think it's bad enough there's no meaningful change in this, but it's only made worse by the fact that they're playing around with it, right? I mean, this is like we said, I mean, it's performative. So it's not even that they're not willing to move forward on meaningful change or meaningful reform, but they're screwing with us with this bill.
Well, and we've seen this so many times. I mean, this is a Senate that has failed to bring up for a vote over 200 bills that had bipartisan support in the House. And now for them to sort of say that somehow the Democratic-led House is in bad faith for not wanting to take up their policing bill is pretty rich. We have literally over 200 bipartisan bills that the Senate won't take up. And they want to come at us for not taking up their strictly partisan approach to so-called justice. I think that's really a problem.
Right. And I do think the American people are smart enough to be able to see through it. So there's that. I did want to ask, do you think this kind of obvious bad faith grandstanding is pushing young people away who seem to be able to see through this kind of stuff?
Well, one of the things that I think a lot about, and I don't hear a lot of talk about, and I would actually love to get your thoughts on too, is the fact that Democrat or Republican majority in the House or the Senate, Democratic president, Republican president, over the last 20 to 30 years, Congress's reputation has gone down. And, Democrats took the House majority. Obviously, I was part of that. I think that's a good thing. I think we're voting for a lot of things that can improve people's lives. But the reality is the typical American still has a low opinion of Congress. They see us as corrupt. They're concerned about what they view as a culture in Washington, and they want institutional change, not just partisan change. And I think that's a really important thing to understand and to acknowledge. And I think when we as Democrats fail to grapple with that, we're missing an opportunity to connect with younger voters, but also independent and no party preference voters who aren't so much moderates, that is ideologically between the parties, as they are disaffected with what they view as a corrupt and ineffective and out of touch political system. And I think that's something that should concern Democrats.
Totally. I mean, look, I think the main thing is you see these people getting paid $174,000 a year to move forward, legislation that basically says, well, let's spend the next 5 years testing to see if marijuana shouldn't be a Schedule I drug. It's performative, and I think that's the thing. I mean, we sit here, and the rest of the world knows what the answer to this kind of stuff is, and yet we have to sit by and say, okay, well, this is the process. And I think it's just, like you said, I mean, it leads to a lot of people being disaffected in the system because you see stuff like that happen, and then you just realize that nothing is actually going to change. So, I mean, until we see actual change, it's going to reduce our, trust in the system that we're paying for.
One of the big changes we have seen in Congress that I often remind people when they say, like, are things changing? How can we make change? Is, a few years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, before the class of 2018 was elected, I think there were 6 members of Congress, counting House and Senate, that did not take corporate PAC money. And today, last time I checked, that number was 66. That is a really big change in how Washington does business, in how we fund campaigns, in empowering grassroots voters, and kind of whose voices are going to be heard, whose voices and priorities are going to become ours. So that is a really big difference. And that difference is all being driven by Democrats like me, who flip competitive districts around the country, running on anti-corruption, running on getting dark money out of politics, running on standing up to corporate special interests, and then have done it.
So I do want to talk about corruption for a second. Let's jump over to Bill Barr's firing of Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. attorney at the SDNY. We just got the announcement that Bill Barr would come testify next month at the end of July, which gives him plenty of time, to make sure that everything that we're seeing right now settles down. And I'm sure he hopes it's going to be forgotten by then. Why does it feel like Democrats can never manage to fight with the tools available to us? Like, why was the answer not to call for him to testify immediately? And if he doesn't, subpoena him. And if he doesn't comply with that, hold him in contempt. And if he still doesn't comply, open an impeachment inquiry. Why aren't we able to use the tools available to us, and especially in the face of such egregious corruption?
Yeah. So look, we have used some of those tools, and the reality is those are tools that are designed for unusual and extreme circumstances. This was baked into the Constitution. Impeachment is supposed to be hard and rare. That was part of a delicate system of checks and balances. We didn't want to have a government where the legislature could quickly toss out the president, but we did want to have a legislative check on the president. So, look, I was the first person who, in a really tough seat, who flipped a district, who came out in support of impeaching President Trump. I was gravely concerned by what I saw in the Mueller report, and those concerns were, I think, doubled down upon when I read what had gone on with the Ukraine. We did that work, and we did not succeed in removing President Trump from office. And I do hear from a lot of my constituents, I can't pay for prescription drugs. I'm spending $1,000 a month for health insurance, and they deny all my claims. We have massive unemployment. I cannot save for my kids' college. These are real concerns that we hear, and I think there is a desire from a lot of constituents across the country to say, can you work on things that will directly improve my life? Now, for a whole lot of reasons, I would argue that whomever is running the Department of Justice does make a difference in everyday Americans' lives. But the quality of justice and the rule of law at the top of the system does matter. to what happens in everyday Americans' lives. And if we have a Department of Justice who won't enforce housing discrimination, who won't enforce employment discrimination, who won't bring on civil rights cases, then I think there is that lack of justice in our daily lives.
Right.
But I think there is a tension between those kinds of issues that people directly connect to their immediate lives that they want us to be working on, and then taking on some of these very important concerns about the president and about his administration. And I am deeply concerned. I think it's very clear that President Trump put Bill Barr into the Department of Justice because Bill Barr would do whatever Trump asked.
Right.
And I think what we're seeing with firing Berman, and I'm very concerned about the potential nomination of Clayton, that what we should draw from that is Clayton will be required to do whatever President Trump asks, because that seems to be a condition of employment for this president.
I don't think that it's an either or with regard to Democrats focusing on kitchen table issues and protecting the foundations of our democracy. And I think when you look at the bills that the House has passed, it's a testament to that, because like you said, I mean, we have hundreds of bills languishing in the Senate that the House has passed, and they've done it successfully, and they've done it even amid the corruption that this administration is steeped in. So I think Democrats have shown that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right?
Yeah. And no, it's funny, whenever people use that analogy, walk and chew gum at the same time, which I think Speaker Pelosi may have been the first one to use, I always think it's aiming a little bit low. I mean, we're not just walking, like we are pushing for change. We are pushing for equality for the LGBTQ community that is long overdue. We are forcing a discussion about police brutality in this country that is long overdue. I mean, these are really meaningful things that we're trying to advance. The anti-corruption bill, HR 1. I mean, and I think that, so it's more than sort of walking and chewing gum. I would say it's sort of pushing while you're pulling, right? I mean, it's really, I think, more effort than I think the walk, chew gum analogy kind of suggests. At least I feel that as a freshman member, that I am putting a tremendous amount of energy into doing this job and into trying to uphold both of those goals of protecting the system, protecting our democracy, protecting the rule of law, delivering accountability, and at the same time trying to tackle what real people need improved and changed in their daily lives.
Well, I think building off of that, one of your most impressive moments was getting the CDC director to agree to free COVID tests for all Americans. With that said, even now, there are still ways in which Americans are still incurring costs. So, for example, sometimes people are showing up with symptoms, but they can't get a COVID test until other illnesses are ruled out. And the mandatory testing for those illnesses still costs money. And you yourself got charged.
What happened to me? Yep.
You yourself got charged for a COVID test. So how do we fix this? And does it involve getting you back in front of Dr. Redfield, or, is he not going to allow that to happen again so long as he shall live?
I think at this point, because in addition to the exchange I had with the CDC director, Dr. Redfield, which was the first promise that we got from the Trump administration that testing would be free, we then enacted that into law in the Families First Act. And so we have repeatedly said this, and this has passed Congress, this has passed the House, this has been signed into law by President Trump, as well as this exchange. This isn't just I got him to yes, and now I'm holding him to his words. Congress then went and made sure that we doubled down on that, and the president signed that into law. I think a lot of the issues now reflect what challenges our insurance companies face in delivering care and in processing claims. And so, what happened to me is that my COVID test was free, but I was charged initially a copay for the visit, which was clearly COVID related. I'd been in touch with my doctor multiple times throughout my illness. And then I got charged for the flu A and flu B tests, which are absolutely necessary to rule out COVID and are really important given that COVID testing is not 100% accurate. Mm-hmm. So if somebody comes in with a positive test for flu B, that even if their COVID test says that they're positive or negative, it's really important to do those in conjunction with each other. So the insurance companies say, well, we didn't have the coding set up. We don't have we're working with different providers. Your doctor didn't use the right claim code. But the reality is they're being paid to sort these things out, and they need to do that work. And we should expect that from our insurance companies. This is exactly what we're paying them to do.
Well, on that note, seems like a great time to hobble the ACA. We just found out that the Trump administration is still still trying to destroy healthcare. They asked the Supreme Court on Thursday to invalidate Obamacare. This was the issue that Trump ran on in 2018, and that was an election that saw Democrats take the House by the biggest margin in U.S. history. So is Trump trying to lose? I mean, what's the actual political upside here? Because it seems like he wants people to die.
Gosh, I cannot begin to fathom what is going on inside Trump's head here. I will tell you, though, on the ground in conversations, I represent a very politically diverse district. I'm the first Democrat to represent this geographic area in 75 years, and Republicans outnumber Democrats still today. I do not hear from constituents on either side of the political aisle that they want to dismantle the ACA. I think that is an issue that has largely been resolved. It doesn't mean we don't need to improve the ACA. I've done a lot of work pushing to try to improve the coverage of mental health care under the Affordable Care Act. And we need to be honest about where the ACA is falling short and trying to improve it. But I don't hear any outcry, even in a Republican traditional area like mine, to invalidate the ACA. I think people right now, particularly with the high rates of unemployment, are very worried about insurance coverage because in our country, as we know, employment and insurance are linked in most situations. And so I'm getting lots of questions for people about, can I still buy insurance on the exchange if I lose my job and I can't afford COBRA? What options are available to me? We've done town halls on that, helping people understand that they're eligible to still purchase insurance on the exchange and potentially get a premium subsidy to do that. So I really don't feel that this is a front and center issue at all for Republicans in my district. In fact, I think the high rate of unemployment makes them very worried about being able to ensure continuity of insurance coverage.
Right. I mean, look, there's a, pandemic still sweeping across the country as much as the Trump administration tries to bury it. And we've seen 125,000 Americans die from it. It just seems completely upside down that this would be the time of all times to try to destabilize the system, right?
I mean, the one thing I'll say sort of at the general, as I look at kind of the issues that are coming to the fore more as we move toward the summer and now into the fall, looking toward the fall, is I do think there's an effort to reboot the playbook, right? To play the game again, to boot it up again. And so I think we're returning to a number of the themes that we saw in the last campaign. And I think that, Americans have had 4 years of experiences with this president. They've had 4 years of seeing where his priorities are. They've had 4 years to see that, in fact, he has not delivered on infrastructure, right? We've had 4 years to see that, in fact, he has not brought down health prescription drug prices. And so I think there's an effort here to kind of repeat what was a winning play, but you're playing on a different field with different players and different conditions. And so that's my best kind of understanding of where this might be coming from. But I have to tell you, I think Americans are rightly worried about hanging on to their insurance coverage and being able to afford healthcare right now.
Right. And by the way, I mean, some of this stuff was a winning play in 2016, but they used the same strategies in 2018, and it was definitely not a winning play. I mean, we just saw a Department of Defense memo come out just a few days ago showing that the Trump administration is sending troops back down to the southern border in October, as if, right on cue, right? Like migrant caravans are coming up from Mexico, just like they did in September, October of 2016, just like they did in September, October of 2018. It is the same playbook over and over. And it might have worked, for whatever reason in 2016, but it shows a complete inability to adapt. And they really it's one note.
Well, I think an inability to adapt, and also, an unwillingness to face up to the problems of the moment. And whether one assigns and how much responsibility one assigns to President Trump for those problems, they are actual problems. This pandemic is killing people, it's killing neighbors and our fellow Americans, and it's killing people around the world. And we need to meet that moment. And the fact that the president sort of is trying to wish it away or will it away, I think that's a lack of kind of transparency and accountability that crosses party lines. I think that people, again, want that from their government. And, I think in my career, I've sort of been, only been in Congress, what is it now, 18 months? It feels like longer than that. That has, I think, been a real hallmark of how I've tried to connect with Americans across ideological divides is we want a fair system. We want to call out bad actors. We want to know if our taxpayer dollars are being spent the way that we were told they were going to be spent, right? And whether we agreed with that expenditure or not, we want to make sure that's actually happening. And so I think there's a real inability to look and stare directly in the face and name the challenges this country faces. You can then debate what do you do about it, but this president, I think, is unwilling to even sort of name and own up to the challenges, which is a little bit separate from being willing to take responsibility for them. But the fact that he won't even do that first step, I think, is really troubling.
Yeah, and I think he came in, I think he hit a roadblock that he hasn't hit before, in the sense that you can't spin away 125,000 dead Americans. You can lie about everything else, and they have, but when people see that their friends and their family and neighbors and doctors and nurses who they knew, everybody's been touched by this. And so you can't just spin it away by showing up at the White House lectern and saying that everything's great. It's disappearing with the heat. It's gone away in April. It's, whatever other excuse they cooked up. You can't spin dead people away.
And I think there's also an interesting issue, because while I have a lot of concerns about how the Trump administration has responded to this pandemic from the very beginning through today, this disease is not the fault of the Trump administration. Viral illnesses happen. Viruses become a problem. We saw them under the Obama administration. This is a thing. So I think this is particularly a good issue to see where the problems with Trump's leadership are, because we don't have to get into an argument about who caused this. The virus is the thing. Now, what are you going to do to lead us forward, right? And I think that's where he's really struggled, is on that, on the execution of strategy to help American people. And I think particularly as we think about school starting in the fall, everything from universities to kindergartens, the lack of a plan, the lack of a strategy, the lack of information from the Department of Education, all of that I think is really staring millions of American parents and school kids in the face.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm glad that you brought that up, because, I think that's on the right. They'll say that, oh, well, Democrats are trying to blame everything on Trump. They're trying to blame coronavirus on Trump. And I think the important thing to recognize is that, of course, coronavirus isn't his fault, but the response does lie squarely on the shoulders of the federal government, right? So, and we don't live in a vacuum. You can look at other countries. You can look at how Australia and New Zealand and Germany and South Korea and a slate of other countries have responded to this. And you can see what appropriate leadership in government does versus what, burying your head in the sand and trying to pretend that it doesn't exist does.
Yeah, and I think in addition to the actual choices we've made as a country, or the failures to use things like the Defense Production Act, there's also, I think, a big problem is there's not a sense of trust that what the president says is going to happen with regard to this administration's response to coronavirus will actually happen. And so I think that is another separate problem. Like, we can debate, when should we have shut down? How much should we have shut down? When should we have begun to import more PPE there's all these things. Different countries have done different things. And we were a large country with a diverse population and a lot of international travel. But the lack of trust that this president has a plan and is conveying it to us truthfully, that's a feeling that Americans have. And I think it's that feeling that is then giving rise to a lot of the lack of confidence in this president.
So I want to jump over to your county, Orange County. You were elected as, part of a historic wave where the OC went from all red to all blue. Have you noticed within that county any grumblings of a resurgence, or do you feel like the OC is going to stay reliably blue in the next election cycle?
Well, there's still an incredibly diverse ideological population in Orange County, and I think you can see that most clearly just as a factual matter by looking at the county and local government. And so 4 of our 5 members of our Board of Supervisors, which the county has a lot of responsibility, particularly with regard to things like public health. 4 of our 5 members of Board of Supervisors are Republican, and all of the mayors, all 10 mayors in the cities within my district are Republican. 9 of the 10 of them have endorsed my opponent, who's a Republican. So I think there's that there's a real legacy there of Republican leadership, of kind of reflexive Republican voting. I think that's then being hit squarely in the face with the realities of some of today's Republican Party. And so if you think about sort of, Orange County as being this sort of famous, where Reagan saying, or Nixon saying, I forget which, like, Orange County exists so good Republicans have a place to go retire and, live out their later years or die. Like, that's not the Republican Party of today. And so a lot of the things that we really value in Orange County, like our beautiful beaches and shoreline and protecting preserved land. And there were people who moved out of places like LA into Orange County because of concern about pollution. So then when we have a Republican Party that's putting polluters in charge of the EPA and letting the fossil fuel industry write the rules for clean air and clean water, that doesn't align with kind of more traditional conservative values of protecting and valuing our environment.
Right. And I mean, look, I think the people in your district, maybe more than any other district in the country, have, a first-time representative in Congress who has shown, maybe more than anybody else that we've seen this year, that you're willing to fight your ass off for your constituents, not only your constituents, for the rest of the American people. So I think that's been made abundantly clear.
Well, I think one of the things that it reflects is kind of back to the point I was talking about at the beginning about, people want to trust Congress. They want to feel that Congress is working for them. And so I think a lot of my freshman colleagues have been quite good at demonstrating that in different ways. But I think a lot of our ability to do that, I mean, this is like one of the things that this class has in common. I mentioned a lot of us don't take corporate PAC money. One of the other things this class has in common is relatively few people who were part of the class that made the majority in the House in 2018 had been in elected office before. There's a handful. But by and large, we were people who were doing other things. We come from being business owners, from being professors, from being nurses, from being in the armed services, from all of these different branches of life and walks of life. And I think we bring to that a different sense of accountability than maybe has been the case, or at least the perceived case, for elected officials. And I think that is helping to create a sense of connection with elected representatives that has been missing.
When you speak to voters, especially coming from what had historically been a red district, what was the biggest misconception that they had about the Democratic Party, and how can we as a party alter our messaging to account for that?
I think one of the things that was probably particular to my district, and then I'll kind of think about the larger kind of across the country issue, but one of the things that was particular to my district was when I knock on doors, people would say, well, I'll vote for you. I'm actually a Democrat, or I lean Democratic, but there aren't any other Democrats on the street. And you're like, well, I actually just knocked on like 5 doors and 4 of the 5 people said they'd vote for me. So that this wasn't a place that was very comfortable with having political conversation. And that was really a contrast for me. I grew up in Iowa, where sort of presidential politics comes to dominate, and everybody, at least every 4 years, really talks about their political opinions. And I think in Orange County, we really value civility. We value respecting difference. And so this idea of kind of talking about politics and how do you do that in a civil way was something that was a change for some of my constituents, that nobody'd ever knocked on their door before. These are not people who get perpetually phone banked in presidential years, because this has not been a battleground in the past. California was safely blue, Orange County was reliably red, and sort of just like, in biblical theory, God created Adam and Eve. These are just truisms. And so I think one of the things I've worked really hard to do is to create an opportunity for respectful disagreement and respectful dialogue. And I think that is something that it's really important for Democrats to continue to affirm. And I see my colleagues across the ideological spectrum really trying to do that within the Democratic side of the aisle. And I think it's really important. And a lot of us ran against opponents who wouldn't go to town halls. In my 2-year campaign, I laid eyes on my opponent one time, and it was for about 30 seconds. Yeah. And so the willingness to kind of stand there and answer tough questions. And I mean, I've been in town halls where people ask me, questions that were, I think, designed to be quite hostile, But I really I'm really glad you asked that. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about that subject. Border security is an issue that we need to come to agreement on in this country, and that starts by understanding the following facts, right? And so I think my background as a professor is to be sort of very factual about trying to give people information. And I think particularly in this moment with this president, the fact that there are facts and we should try to agree on them, and then we can debate what we do about those facts is actually refreshing to a lot of people. And so being a straight shooter, even if people don't agree with you, the fact that you're a straight shooter, I think gets you quite a bit of goodwill. And I've certainly seen that in my district.
And by the way, the ironic part about being a straight shooter is that's actually the pretense under which Trump was elected, right? Which is the biggest piece of irony, because he's the biggest purveyor of misinformation.
But I think it shows you the hunger for that among the American people. So, I mean, look, this was someone who ran on draining the swamp. I personally have a lot of concerns that we are actually moving backwards in terms of corruption in pretty serious ways in a lot of our agencies and in our White House. But I don't think that means that the problem or the perception of the problem of Washington being corrupt, of special interests dominating our politics, of lobbyists setting priorities rather than communities is wrong. I think that he tapped into a real feeling. And I think you see that in the fact that most Americans think that Congress doesn't understand them and isn't putting their interests first. And you see that equally in Republican-held districts and Democratic-held districts. And so I think my whole mission is to try to show through my actions, through the questions I ask in hearings, through how I communicate with my constituents, that I am accountable. I am tough enough to take on their questions. I am tough enough to take on the powerful people who have for a long time run Washington, and to earn their trust in terms of my character, recognizing that debate about issues is a healthy part of democracy. Distrust of government is not. And I think that's an enemy that it's too bad we can't work more across party lines to tackle that problem of a lack of confidence in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a hunger for that on both sides. I don't personally think that we're going to see that with the current slate of Republicans that are serving right now. So with that said, I guess that's a good segue into your new leadership PAC called the Truth to Power PAC. Well, first, can you explain, I guess, the difference between a leadership PAC and, the corporate PACs that you were just speaking about?
So leadership PAC can be set up by a federal elected official, and the money raised into that leadership PAC can be used to support candidates for office. And so in our case, this is a grassroots funded PAC, and what we're going to be doing with it is supporting new voices and bringing back the majority, of course, but primarily supporting new voices to help improve the diversity of representation and the quality of representation of the American people in Congress. And so I'm really excited about our first slate of endorsements. It includes folks like Candace Valenzuela, who's an Afro-Latino woman, was a young mother, and at one time had been homeless. She's just a terrific person in a tough race. In Texas, she has a competitive primary runoff, and then she's taking on an incumbent Republican in the fall. But I think that the goal of this is to recognize that we do need people who, when they get to Washington, will hold powerful people to account. And with regard to the difference between how this kind of organization like Truth to Power works and how corporate PACs work, I think a lot of us would agree, including across the aisle, at least among the American people, that we think corporations have too much political power, that they are writing the rules about prescription drugs, that they are writing the rules about clean air and water, that they are writing the rules about so many areas that touch our lives, and that we in fact want our constituencies, our voters, our communities to be writing these rules and guiding us and connecting with us. And so Truth to Power PAC is about finding people who, when they get to Congress, will put their constituents first, will put people over profit, and will stand up to corporations. It doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't listen to businesses. Big businesses are often big employers. And I believe in capitalism, but I think we have to push toward having a healthy, strong, stable capitalist system. And I think it's really questionable, for example, what value corporate PAC contributions how that serves shareholders in any meaningful, real way. And so I'm really excited about the organization. I'm excited the first 4 candidates that have had elections, all won. So we're 4 for 4 so far, and then have a few more elections coming up. But I always say we named the PAC Truth to Power. But I think the real thing that I hope these candidates will achieve when they are elected is that they will not only speak truth to powerful people, but they will do what I try to do in each of my hearings, which is get powerful people to themselves admit the truth. And that's a lot of, if you think about my exchange with someone like JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, I'm well aware of how hard it is to be a single mom and make ends meet, because I am a single mom living in Irvine. But I want him to admit that that is a challenge, and that the wage he's paying in his bank leaves a family grasping to pay for food and to pay for rent. And so I think that the name is not just about speaking truth to power, but also about getting powerful people to admit the truth and own up to what their responsibility is in trying to tackle problems.
So how can we help? Where can we donate?
Yeah, well, so let me tell you, Truth to Power PAC has a social media handle. It's at truth_PAC, P-A-C, and our website is truthtopowerpac.com. And when you go there, you can learn more about the PAC. We have a video there you can watch talking about its purpose. And then we also feature the candidates. And you can make a contribution there to support the organization or to directly support the candidates.
Well, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for taking the time to talk. And, we're all pushing for you as hard as we can for this upcoming election.
Well, we're all going to do it together. Thank you so much for having me.